Okay. So I was thinking for today's Dharma talk what to talk about, and I thought I'd talk about suffering. And just a little bit of background on, I know, I just thought it would draw a crowd, I was like, what more sexy topic could there be? And you see it worked. But just a little bit of my own sort of personal relationship around or the topic of suffering in terms of the teachings. When I first started offering teachings and meditation when we lived at Tarmandala, I remember I never wanted to talk about suffering. I was like, I'm not going to introduce Buddhism by talking about suffering. So I would always start by talking about Buddha nature, because Buddha nature is so beautiful. It's our inherent awakened quality, our wholeness already as we are, perfected, nothing to do, nowhere to go. Now, that's where I want to start, because that's what motivates me. That's why I'm on this path. Like suffering, God, it's kind of dark and dim and gloomy, and So it's been, that was 11 years ago. So here I am, and I'm like, well, maybe it's time to talk about suffering, which is a bit ironic, of course, because when you look at the Buddha's life, suffering was really what got him going. And it was his awareness, recognition, or his experience with suffering in his life after leading a very sheltered life, first coming in contact with suffering, old age, sickness, and death, that he became inspired to go on his journey, on his spiritual seeking in the first place. It wasn't because he had some awareness of Buddha nature. It was actually because he saw suffering. And then what did he teach coming out of his enlightenment? The very first thing he taught about was suffering. He taught the Four Noble Truths. And what's the first noble truth? The truth of suffering. So really, this is an admission that it's taken me this long to start with letter A, which is really the beginning of the whole Buddhist teachings. And when the Buddha taught about the Four Noble Truths, he taught them both as truths, but also as sort of calls to certain actions that are associated with each of the truths. And so the first noble truth of the truth of suffering is connected with the call to recognize it or understand it. We must understand suffering. And it's actually quite a profound teaching, I think, or call, because it's saying it's not enough to just say, oh yes, we suffer, but that we must look at our suffering. We must truly understand our suffering. And of course, our tendency, the minute we feel any kind of suffering, is to want to get rid of it, is either to ignore it or to fix it or to make it go away, but not to say, aha, let me understand my suffering. Let me recognize my suffering. Let me come to know it. And this is really what the Buddha was teaching with the First Noble Truth. Understand the nature of suffering. So what is suffering? How do we define suffering? And I think it's defined in the Buddhist teachings in many different ways. But for me, the most helpful ways have been a way to make a distinction between gross suffering, which is sort of the suffering we normally think of, the suffering of suffering, which is illness, sickness, death. Many of us don't experience this, but hunger, fear of losing our lives. And then there's sort of the derivatives of that, of not getting what we desire, of not fulfilling our dreams, of not reaching our goals, of getting what we didn't want, of having what we love but knowing we're going to lose it one day, the small disappointments in life, the physical pains. So there are all those types of suffering. And then there's what I consider, or I call a more subtle suffering. And I think often in the West, particularly those of us who live the privileged lives of generally not having to deal with hunger, not living in a war zone, we can often say, well, we don't really have suffering. I mean, come on, we're privileged. But I think this is where the subtle sense of suffering is very important to look at. And it's this suffering that's the subtle anxiety of never feeling like right now is good enough. There's always just a better moment, or I'm just about to be a little more perfect, or if I just were this way, then I would be a kinder human being, a more intelligent human being, or a better teacher or a better mother or a better wife or a better, just over there. It's just there. There's a great, I don't know if you know the poet, Wendell Berry is a naturalist poet, and I often use these lines from one of his poems. That old dream of going, of becoming a better man just by getting up and going to another place. That old dream of going. And, on a literal level, it's that sense that I think we've all felt at times in our life. Oh, if I just get up and move somewhere else, then my life will, then, sort of my neuroses will fall away. It'll be exciting, I'll be a new me. But there's the metaphorical reading of that dream of going, of somewhere out there, there's a better place. There's a more perfect me, a more perfect reality. And Trungpa Rinpoche calls this, suffering is dukkha. And dukkha is basically translated also as dissatisfaction. And so Trungpa says it's this feeling that something is lacking, incomplete in our lives. Somehow something is not quite right, not quite enough. So we are always trying to fill the gap. The continuing action of struggle and preoccupation is very irritating and painful. Eventually, one begins to become irritated by just being me, because that me is the one that's not quite enough, not quite at the right point. And I put this quote in the Sangha email this week, but I've been reading the Songsar Khyentse Rinpoche book called Not for Happiness, which is a great book about practice. He says, don't practice Dharma if you think you're going to become happy. Go get a massage instead. But that's the pith version of it. But here he talks about wealth and what for the practitioner is a sense of wealth. And he says, for a Dharma practitioner, wealth is not gold, silver, or a healthy bank account. Wealth is contentment, the feeling that you have enough and need nothing more. So not just at a physical level, obviously, but at an inner level as well. So this is that subtle suffering that I think we can probably all relate to, but I think it's subtle because our whole purpose is to get over it, is to not recognize it, because we're busy getting to the next moment, right? And what's in the moment is the suffering of thinking the moment isn't actually perfect enough. So this subtle sense of suffering, which is pervasive suffering, is really kind of goes to the core of the teachings. And the core of the teachings is really, and this is where we come to Buddha nature, is that this anxiety comes from some subtle sense that we aren't totally whole. We're not one with the ground of being. We aren't complete. That somehow that ground, that ultimate home, is somewhere. There's a sense of that feeling of wholeness, of having grounded ourselves in the ultimate ground of being, but we're not there yet. And this, according to the teachings, is simply a mistake. The ground of being is emerging right now. We have never been separate from the ground of being. In all our confusion and all our seeming imperfections, we are the perfect emanation, radiance of the ground of being, called the Ji. Right now, just as we are, in every moment. We can't be separate from it. We can never be other from it. We have never been. We will never be apart from it. So it's simply a matter of either recognizing that or not recognizing it. And when we don't recognize it, there's an anxiety. It's like, I need to get back to that place. I need to get back home. I need to get back to wholeness. But it's simply not recognizing we are already there all the time. So, great. So how do we deal with suffering? How do we deal with it when it arises? And so I want to just mention three pieces. And the first is from this absolute teaching of the ground of being. If that's truly the case, if we are already perfected, then what do we do as we suffer? If our suffering is some sense of not being right, not being whole, if that's just non-recognition, do we do something about it? No. And these are the beautiful teachings on just rest. If we are already perfected, if we are already in the ground of being, with the ground of being, then actually doing gets us further away. Resting in it is the most perfect, most appropriate response. And this is where, and we probably sound like a broken record at this point, but these teachings on taking a short moment, Tulku Orgyen Rinpoche's teaching, taking a short moment, using our suffering. So as our particular form of suffering arises, and we all have our particular forms of suffering, which we also call our demons, obviously, in this lineage. So as that particular suffering arises, using it as an alarm bell. I think I mentioned this the other day. I said, like, wait a minute. I know you. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a short moment and I'm going to let my awareness rest. Rest in space and awareness. Just rest. I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to fix it. I'm going to actually become more present right here. So that's sort of the absolute view on suffering and dealing with suffering. And there's another piece of what to do with our suffering, and this is so beautiful to me, which is really that suffering is the doorway to compassion. Thich Nhat Hanh has a beautiful piece called The Nobility of Suffering. And it's a sense, wow, nobility of suffering, what's that about? But it's really, he says, I would not want my children to grow up without ever experiencing pain and suffering. Because it is when we experience pain and suffering that we are able actually to open our hearts and connect with the pain and suffering of another. It's when we're self-contented, we're on our little private island. But when we're in pain, when we feel suffering, we have an incredible capacity to connect with others. And so the sense is, Lama Tsultrim talked about this in terms of her grief when David died. She said, once I started thinking about it, not so much as my grief of having lost my husband, but the widow's grief of having lost one's partner. And suddenly, for me it's helpful almost on a visual level, suddenly it's like you think of the network of everyone who's lost someone that they loved. And that network lights up around the globe. And there you are. And it's not that your suffering goes away, but it's shared. You are in a network of open-hearted, raw, vulnerable pain. And there's something in that sharing that's incredibly both healing and expansive. And the closeness and the tightness of suffering is actually relieved when we begin to use our own suffering as a way to connect with the suffering of others. I'm working with someone who has just gone through cancer, and she was talking about how she was doing metta practice or loving kindness practice, thinking about other people who were dealing with cancer in their lives and how that helped in her process and is helping. So when we think about our suffering, and even if it's a little suffering, like I know I often do this before I teach, and sometimes I get into this sort of nervous state, and then I think, okay, who are all the other teachers about to go into class nervous about teaching? And let me think about them. And then somehow it's like, oh, it's okay. It's all right. We're in this together. It's not just me suffering all by myself. And there's something... Suffering, I know. It begins very early. Oh, God, it's great having kids, actually. Because you see that suffering, that just the next thing will, make me happy, and then it doesn't, and then it's the next thing, and yeah. The toys get bigger, the sufferings get bigger, but the process is exactly the same, right? Yeah. So the network is suffering, and I think. We've talked about this too before, but the neuroscientists that are doing this work at what parts of the brain light up during compassion meditation, and that compassion meditation is actually connected to the left frontal lobe. I think that's right. Is that right, McKenna? Prefrontal. Okay, left. I got all these psychologists in the room. Which is also connected, if I'm remembering this right, with positive emotions and with positive feelings. So that in a very simple way you could say having compassion, raising compassion for others makes you happy. That's the simple formula. So I think in this, that what I've laid out here in terms of using our own suffering as a way to connect to the suffering of others makes us happier, actually. So that's another way to work with suffering. And obviously the Tonglen practice is kind of taking this another step and saying, I'm not just going to use my suffering as a way to connect with other beings, but hey, why don't I take it all on? Here I am suffering after all anyway. So what if I've activated this network and I'll do it for you? I'll just be nervous all by myself here. I'll take everyone else's nervousness and you guys just walk into your classrooms without a bit of nervousness. I could do that. I could actually do that. So Tonglen is just that next step. And we actually have the capacity. We have incredible capacity. So suffering as really the doorway, the portal to compassion. And then finally, the third piece is suffering, to work with our suffering as a catalyst, to see it as almost like the spice of life, the grist in the mill of our experience. And here, the teachings on the human realm are very beautiful because it says the human realm has just the right mixture of freedom and capacity to practice and suffering, which motivates us to practice. The gods have lots of freedom and lots of pleasure, but they don't have enough suffering to ever motivate them to practice until finally they realize that they too will die, and then it's a little too late. And those in the hell beings, or even animals, and we could have a debate about animals, I'm always a little on the fence about these teachings, but have so much suffering that they actually don't have enough freedom to practice. But humans, we have just the right ratio. And it's the sense that suffering is sort of the fire underneath our butts. It gives us the little bit of kick, that sense of like I'm going to do something about this. I'm motivated to practice because it's not just easy sitting around here all the time. How geese swallow pebbles in order to digest the grass and the seeds they eat? So I almost think of it, it's like suffering in our life is like that bit of tension, the spark. It's like the spark plugs in the engine of our life that gives us a little bit of oomph to move. What am I doing in my life? How can I show up? How do I relate to another human being? What am I doing in my work? So it's that bit of tension that creates a wakefulness in our lives. And Chogyam Trungpa talks about humor, and I think humor is really important here. And he says, we tend, especially in our spiritual practice, to get really serious, and things are really real and really dense. And then we can just have a sense of humor. And that sense of humor is just cracking it open. And what humor does is it pops us into big mind. And you can know that feeling when you laugh, like something just releases, something opens. And so, in a way, this brings us full circle so that when we can hold this vastness, if we already are one with the ground of being, and there's nowhere to go to get more perfect, then our suffering is that spice, it's that play, it's that grist in the mill that wakes us up, that allows us to see it, then that humor allows us to see our suffering as a key ingredient of our whole experience, which colors it, brings out the rainbows and the black. And I'll just end with this. I think another reason that I sometimes shy away from talking about suffering is that I say, who am I, privileged white American woman, to be talking about suffering and bringing humor into suffering? Like, yeah, easy for you to say, right? But there's a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning, and he writes about the concentration camps. And one of the messages in that is that those people who were able to maintain a sense of meaning in their lives and value in their lives and beauty in their lives, despite the most horrendous suffering, they were able to more likely survive. And so I think if we ever, and I find myself sometimes in the state of thinking, oh, that person or those people are suffering too much to ever be free of their suffering. That is the greatest imposition we can make on someone, because it's taking our ultimate freedom, which is to be able to find joy within our deepest suffering, no matter how intense, how horrendous our suffering. And that is the human potential, and that is Buddha nature that is always arising. So with humility and deep gratitude for the life I've had, I think it's worthwhile for all of us, no matter in what state of privilege or non-privilege we sit, to dive into and understand our suffering, because I think it's an amazing gateway.